And we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next Hangout for the Human MOOC. Sorry for the confusion there. I apparently used a website that was not very good on the time zones. And when I looked on my iPhone, it actually gave me the correct time. So, so we're improvising here, and we are going with kind of the original time that I had announced, which was 4 p.m. Central. It was actually supposed to be 5 p.m. Central, which is 10 a.m. Australian time. Apologize for that. We'll just kind of roll with it, since most people are expecting the current time right now. So in this call, we've actually decided to open it up. If you want to actually join the conversation, just let us know, and we will try to get, we can only have up to 10 people, I believe is the limit that Google Hangout on Air allows. But if you want to join the conversation, please join in. Because with us today, all the way from Australia, or if you're in Australia, then that's not that far, but for me here in Texas at least, is Kate Bowles. I've had the privilege of working with her on the DLearn project. I'll let her introduce herself here in a moment. She has some really, if you follow her on Twitter or her blog, she has some wonderful thoughts on all kinds of things, but the topic for today is being mindful. And so I'll just, or actually, I'll just throw over to you, Kate. You can introduce yourself and then talk with us a little bit about some of the things you shared with me in email and why this is an important topic to you. So now over to Kate.
Thanks so much, Matt. Look, this is an enormous privilege to join in this conversation with Human MOOC. I think what you guys are doing is really so important. I've been teaching online since just before the web. So I've taught online using a whole range of different environments, platforms, technologies, patched together solutions that were often fairly crude. And over that period of time, as we've become progressively more engaged with high-tech companies with lots of money and solutions for us, I've seen the human in online become smaller. And I'm so delighted that this MOOC and this way of thinking is advocating for a return to the really basic questions that brought so many of us online in the 90s in the first place, which was that something quite magical can happen in online education, which is entirely human. I think this morning's slight confusion about time zones is actually right at the heart of what's magical. That someone on the other side of the world can connect to you. You're sitting in your spot, I'm sitting in my spot. It's ridiculous that this is possible in our lifetimes. People are alive today all around us for whom this would be an unthinkable piece of magic. And somewhere over the 15-year history or so of online education that I've been involved with, that magic has dimmed a little. We've slightly lost interest in presence and the excitement of it. So I'm really thrilled. I'm really thrilled to get to be here from my time zone. I'd like to say also it's summertime here. I mean, how crazy is that? You know, you guys are all talking about winter, and I'm sitting here watching out of my window my campus get ready for the big summer graduation. You know, they're putting up tents because it'll be hot. I'm looking out of my window at a campus that is very quiet because it's the big summer holiday. So, how might we be mindful of this when we think about putting the human into our online strategy? All I really wanted to say by way of an introduction, and then Matt, you and I can chat. I spent yesterday looking at the videos, the video introductions for Human MOOC, and I just was so gripped by them. I loved them. Autumn, I loved your unintroduction. And I was just so taken with everything that you can see over the shoulders of people when they video themselves. What you see is the background to their lives. So many people, so many of us work online from our homes. And that's a very particular professional kind of space for us. I work online from the house that I share with my children, with my partner, and I am myself as a professional in that space. What you see behind me here is my office. And my office is a very peculiar space because I only recently acquired it after a return to work. And so I have a bookshelf with no books and a filing cabinet with nothing in it at all, and a completely blank wall, and kind of a single photograph that my daughter gave me so I would have something. When I'm in this office, I always feel, if I'm videoing, that I feel like I've gone into the witness protection program. I've gone to somewhere profoundly anonymous. Whereas when I'm in my home, you can see my life, you can see the way that I organize my space. And so I looked over the shoulders of everyone in the Human MOOC. I wanted to see, what was that painting? What was that picture? What was that ceiling? What was that light fitting? And then I saw a video that said, I haven't followed the instructions about doing this professionally. I haven't put on makeup. I haven't. So I went and looked for the instructions. I thought, oh, there's instructions. I'll go and see what they are. And there's a transfixing sentence in the middle of the Human MOOC instructions for making a video that says, be mindful of setting. And you have to make sure that it's appropriate. And I thought, well, actually, the thing about setting is it's the context in which our lives are inappropriate, messy, disorderly. And if we ask ourselves to remove all of that extraneous clutter, one of the things we remove is a part of the human that's really important to who we are as educators and to what makes us different from one another. So I remember people by the things they have over their shoulders, by the television just playing in the background, by the glimpse of another room. I've already seen over Autumn's shoulder in this Hangout and over Matt's shoulder in this Hangout details about your lives. And that's how I'm going to remember you. So I think I wanted to just say this morning that maybe we can problematize that idea of mindfulness being harnessed to tidiness, because I think that's the wrong way to think about mindfulness. Matt, do you want to ask a question? I just lay that out for you, that I'm here to problematize the current way in which we're talking about mindfulness as something that can make us more productive, something that can make us more efficient as professionals. And I want to say, I think mindfulness simply asks us to be less judgmental and to be attentive to the details of our lives. So I would like a different I'd like to flip that version of mindfulness and say mindfulness really invites us to be not without judgment, conscious of the details that we see before us. And that's what makes instruction human. Matt, I'm open for questions.
No, that's good. I'm trying to get my mouse to agree with me here. And Autumn, if you have anything, feel free to ask too. So one of the things is when you talk about mindfulness, you start getting a lot of pushback from people that say, well, no, that messiness is going to make us less productive, or it's going to take up more time. So what would your response be to someone like that, especially in an educational setting that would maybe, I don't know, maybe more traditional mindset, or more, I don't want to say traditional, but from the mindset that we don't want these things and it's going to actually make us less productive? What would be your response to something like that?
Look, I think that's a really interesting question, Matt. I'm puzzled by the current incarnation of mindfulness harnessed as it has been to productivity, because it is such a profound contradiction to mindfulness. And it's particularly in that question of acceleration. We are now turning to mindfulness to make us go faster, when everything about mindfulness is about slowing down. Mindfulness, if it is working correctly, perhaps ought to make us less productive, in the sense that mindfulness is not about continually generating stuff. So I think perhaps embracing mindfulness on its own terms will complicate things for the way that we're using it in corporate and educational settings at the moment. I don't know where this has come from, the idea of mindfulness as an efficiency technique, and I'm really quite startled by it. But I think here, for our purposes as educators who are trying to be mindful in the smallest, most vernacular sense that we can use those terms, we can usefully reattach mindfulness to an idea of attentiveness. Because I think attentiveness is something else that needs rescuing. since the attention economy got a whole lot of attention, we also started to misuse attentiveness to mean successful. So if we are getting lots of clicks and lots of likes and lots of attention, we've made that a metric for productivity as well. So both mindfulness and attentiveness, which are reflective practices, have become harnessed to an agenda of productive practices. As educators who are interested in critical listening to the world that we're in, we have an enormous capacity and motive to try to recover both of these positions, and to say mindful education and attentive education is absolutely reinstating the human in our online environments. So I think that's my answer to that is simply those voices that say, well, this kind of mindfulness will make us less productive. The answer is to calmly say, yes, it will. And I'm okay with that. If I could just sort of extend this a moment, I've been thinking a lot. Yesterday I received a whole lot of student evaluations, as we do at this time of year, and I was reading through the comments. And a comment that absolutely struck me in a class that had been extraordinarily highly engaged and very successful, quite transformative. One student said, "But I don't think my voice was heard." And I'm carrying that student very closely with me at the moment. It was an anonymous evaluation, so I don't know who it was. But it seems to me that this is also something that happens in MOOCs, that there are MOOCs that we can come to feel as community gatherings and the development of communities of presence. We're transforming and engaging, and everyone remembers them years later and they're still engaged. And what actually happens there is that the circle that includes everyone actually is quite small. What it means is some highly engaged people are still highly engaged quite a while later. But I think attentiveness and mindfulness both ask us to think about that quiet voice that says, I don't think my voice was heard. And as online educators, maybe to try to figure out how we sort out our environments so that we're conscious of the people who are not naturally coming to our attention, who are not naturally calling attention to themselves. So this relates to a long-standing interest that I have in introverts in online education, how we come to listen for the other kinds of participation than speaking. How we notice online, particularly the people who are listening. And I was noticing some comments in Human MOOC yesterday about the forums that almost immediately, as soon as a MOOC sets off, forums become uncuratable, unmanageable. Everyone talks at once. And I think there are people whose voices perhaps don't get heard so clearly under those circumstances. So I'm interested to know whether you have a thought about that, Matt, as someone curating that stream of presence.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've kind of gotten comfortable in education with being okay with some of those voices not being heard, right? It's almost as if, you didn't participate, so you don't get the points, and too bad. It's been an unfortunate. It's been going on for decades, longer than that even. But I think it's good that we're bringing attention to it. And one of the things in a MOOC, I did try to wade into the forums the other day, and you're right. It's just like, wow, there's so much in here. I could spend all day reading all these and still not remember all this, right? Because there's just so many people in there. I think one of the things we're trying to do with the Pathways design is to create different spaces out there that still serve the same purpose, so that whether it's on your blogs or in the forum, it's in the Connect area or these other places, we're not trying to create something to where everyone is involved in every single one of these spaces. We're trying to create something that gives a lot of different options so that you can accommodate more people and more voices. Of course, they all tend to start looking the same. There's not a whole lot of difference between the Connect area and the edX discussion forums. But that's because we're still exploring the idea. But that's our hope, is that at some point, in all of our classes, we try to seem to funnel all students into the same stream, the same pathway, and the same steps. And that's where you start losing people, is because you just can't fit a whole lot of people into the same stream, right? You can't fit people into the same pathway. There's just only so much space in those, so much bandwidth or whatever you want to call it. So when people ask why we offer all these options, isn't that hard to watch and isn't that hard to curate? Well, the hope is that each one of those streams will be a place for more people to have a voice and more people to step out from being the wallflower or the introvert. As someone myself who has kind of introverted tendencies, I try to keep that in my mind. But it's an ongoing work in progress. So we're trying to, so it may not work in the way we have it now, but that's kind of the goal where we're working, is that those will all be spaces where they can come out. And then as far as curating it, well, we'll have to figure that one out too.
I'm interested in this, that immediately you said when you were wading, that was such an interesting word, wading through the forums. And I'm sure we've all said that at some point, wading through this tide of human communication. And I feel like I can't pay close attention enough to enough of it. And so many people find themselves adrift. They don't connect. No one connects to them. No one hears them. I'm finding myself thinking that online platforms now have so many devices for checking with the group, so many polls and surveys, but we're using them to ask the wrong questions. We're often using them to ask questions that will result in an accessible outcome. Quizzes, for example. But the most useful thing perhaps for a quiz tool is to say, how are you going? Do you feel included? I realize now that in that highly engaged class filled with quite extroverted individuals, but not exclusively extroverted, there were others. If I had used something like a Brookfield's Critical Incident Questionnaire, adapted a little bit, because I use that a lot in my teaching. If I had used something to say, do you feel included? All of the responses earlier. That's a manageable way to do it, because you can do it as a survey question. And then you can start to see, well, I'm really responding to all of these people who are really responding to my course. But there's a substantial population who don't yet feel that they've connected. And maybe I need to look at that in aggregate. You know me, Matt, I'm not really a fan of data, but that seems to me a reasonably useful way to use aggregate data to say my impression level of engagement in this course is a human impression. I feel that because I can find a reasonable number of people who are highly engaged with my ideas, that this is going swimmingly. But if I could see all of these people saying, actually, it hasn't yet worked for me in human terms, I would understand something differently. So I'm wondering about whether Canvas and the other platforms that we commonly use can be tweaked a little bit to use some of the tools that are there for other purposes, just to say, how are you? Is this making sense for you? And not necessarily to generate a whole lot of information that we can't wade through, but just yes, no. I'm often aware when we teach face-to-face, particularly very large classes, often the very first thing that comes out of our mouths in a huge lecture theatre is, can you hear me up the back? And we do that on a kind of show of hands. We're just doing a sound check. What is a sound check online? It's a kind of simple yes, no. Are you engaged? Are you okay? Do you know how to contact me if you're feeling that this is not really working? So I guess that is my thought there. Acknowledging the wading in feeling, but finding a way of checking that people have pathways to reconnect if they're starting to drift. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, and that's a very, very good way to look at it. We do ask those questions face to face, but we don't ask them online as much, or ever sometimes.
And the pop quiz tools are the ideal way to do it. Our environments are filled with pop quiz tools. Why don't we make them human? Why don't we humanize the pop quiz facility and use it to ask human questions? Sorry, Autumn, you were going to say something.
I just wanted to let you guys know we might We might get somebody else to pop in. So Daniel just told me that he's got some questions about the data viz, and you kind of broke up on me a little bit there, Kate, so I think I missed that part, but I did tweet him a link, so he might jump in here in a second. So just be ready for that, and don't think like, oh my God, where did this guy come from? So, um, but so I had a question before we even started everything, and my question had to do with can mindfulness help us realize our responsibilities to each other? Because I feel like especially when we jump out of that kind of fixed pathway type of situation where there's certain expectations, and if you meet those expectations, then everything's fine. But when we open that up, where maybe we're not going to be able to hear those voices, right? Because it's just like a discussion forum, and if somebody isn't contributing, maybe we're not really
Autumn, I've just lost you a little bit there.
and make it so that we can have these good relationships online.
Look, I think that's a really interesting proposition. What I'd like to suggest is that maybe we need to not turn to mindfulness for everything. I think in the way that we speak to one another, we have a way of saying mindful that does bring in those other values: attentive, accountable, responsible, caring. And we're freighting mindfulness with all the good things. What mindfulness brings to our deliberations is simply the capacity to be non-judgmentally present with ourselves and non-judgmentally present in the world. And it doesn't, a lot of critics of mindfulness say, well, how can mindfulness therefore be attached to or create energy for social change? For example, if you're non-judgmentally accepting of the things that are, what would ever incentivize social change? And the answer is probably not mindfulness. But I do think that we need exactly what you're speaking about, Autumn, this idea of an accountable presence for others. And I don't think we need to call it mindfulness for it to work. But the idea of accountable presence is the basis of the human interaction in online education and other kinds of education. I see you, I recognize that your trouble in the world is different from my own. I recognize that your place in the world is distinctive and dear to you. And I won't assume anything about you on the basis of the things that I know about myself. So I won't rule in or out any possibility of what is critical for you at the moment. But I will pay attention. And then if you choose to identify to me that this thing that I've been observing is also important to you, I can accept that. I can take that on board. So it seems to me that this gets to another issue that is very dear to many of us, and I think we're trying to figure out how to advance an agenda for it. And this might relate to Daniel's question. How do we, alongside the rise of data in our sphere, how do we make space for the kinds of stories and narratives of practice and experience that enable us to become visible to one another on a smaller scale? And I think higher education is absolutely ready for narrative research. Narrative research and narrative practice is fundamentally about the human. The human that is before me because that human has a story different to my own. So that story is very incompletely represented in data terms, and that story is the ground of that person's expertise in what brings them to this point. So I think we need to let go of expecting mindfulness to be the magic bullet for every corporate setting and every educational endeavor, and instead say there are a whole lot of other values that join with mindfulness that can enable us to do something quite new. And I think for me the end point of that is narrative, that this is the moment that we need to start advocating for narrative practices in educational settings. And to do that, we had to let go of mindfulness, which we've held on to a bit tightly. Does that make sense?
I think so. I really like what you're saying a lot, and I like that it's sort of divorced from the technology so much. I think the technology makes it a little more complicated. But, I mean, even if we just think of writing as a technology, right, it's a way for us to bring that story through us, out of us, but it's getting at something deeper. It's just a means of communication. It's not, you know, it's not going to be able to get at those, you know, some of those more complex kind of things without deeper thought.
And deep thought is in some ways what we're tremendously lacking in higher education at the moment. We have excluded and marginalized the possibility that deep thought could be useful because we're driven by routines of metrics of productivity that entirely privilege outputs over the process by which outputs are derived. And the process is where we make space for the human. The output is what it is. It goes on in the world. The publication or the presentation or the monograph, they go their way in the world. They are their own thing. But the process by which they were arrived at is the process of being human in a world. And I think higher education at the moment is struggling to understand process because it seems so inefficient. Couldn't machines do this better? So what is being done by Matt and the team there in Human MOOC, to me, is the most important thing that we're doing in higher education at the moment, which is advocating for the return of the human to this domain where the human has largely been rendered problematic. So the humans who are in higher education are almost always the problem for higher education's greater goals, institutionally and corporately. And I think that we can no longer go along with this. We can no longer go the human as the thing that is being spoken about when we say dismissive things. Human space. Traditional is an entirely red herring at this point. There are just humans being themselves, and that is the process that produces the things we're proudest of. Matt, is this useful to you? Is there something else you'd like to ask?
This is very useful. This is exactly what we're looking for, and it's exactly kind of the thoughts and the ideas that we want people to consider in the Human MOOC. Is not just the technologies, not just the how do I make a video, how do I create how do I connect more with my students, or how that is the question we want them to focus on, is how do I connect more, how do I use these different tools and not just make, and even the ideas like mindfulness, like you said, we don't want to use mindfulness as a solution for everything. I think that's a very good point, because that's something we do a lot in education. We just look for that one solution for everything, right? Whether it's technology, whether it's an idea, whether it's a theory, we focus in on the one idea and we try to use that to solve everything. So I'm glad you said that. And I think we have Daniel joined us here. Daniel?
I made it.
Okay. I think you had a question. Did we get that question already, or do you want to go ahead and ask that?
I'm actually not even sure, because there was a point of time between when Autumn sent me the link and when I actually just got back on the chat. So I have no idea what just happened in the last 8 minutes.
We were doing a little bit of troubleshooting too, because I sent him the wrong link the first time, so I apologize for that.
Oh, it's okay.
No, most of my question was around like social network analysis and data visualization stuff. And when Kate was talking earlier about interactions on different platforms, especially in the discussion forums, I know it's not like a be-all, end-all kind of answer, but I found it useful in different courses, as have some profs that I've worked with, to look at data visualization of ways of seeing where your outliers are in a course and how to try and bring them back into conversations. So I was wondering how much you guys maybe already talked about that while I wasn't in the chat.
My interest in that, that's a really productive sort of provoking question for me at the moment, Daniel. Thank you. I work with people who produce beautiful visualizations of Twitter participation in their courses, and I think, like everyone, I find data visualizations quite mesmerizing. I will peer at them for a long time. But as with all representations of data, particularly at scale, I also find myself as an ethnographer and a qualitative researcher thinking, what is this actually telling me? This is telling me, for example, with Twitter, the number of times a person tweeted. But what I can't see are the things that I know are critical to education. Listening. I can't see engaged listening. And so I find that a lot of these visualizations, but I agree with you that platforms of all kinds have shown us more and more inventive ways of checking in, using analytics to check in who is in some kind of trouble that appears to be represented by not participating, the outliers, as you call them. But I find myself feeling that as those techniques become more advanced and more sophisticated, they're also slightly changing the way that we value different types of participation, and we increasingly value what can be made visible. And in the interests of the human, I wonder if we're going to move to a point where we can become more able to understand what's in those gaps between the highly active nodes in a network, for example, because the gaps between the nodes are not necessarily failures to be nodes. They're just other ways of being in a network. And so when we see nodal stars emerging from data visualization, I think we don't understand the valleys in that data very well at all. But I say this, Daniel, with a great caution, because it's not my area of expertise. So I think this is a whole realm for me of more questions than answers, and that comes from my own lack of expertise in this area.
No, that is actually, those are similar concerns that I've had with other profs as well, is that it doesn't really measure those kind of, I don't know if you can say like soft skills, or as you said, like listening or engagement. You can't really measure those things by saying like the size of a node and, you know, how many times they interact with different people. So I think that is a really good point to make. I'm curious as well, like, or something I'm excited for, is that there are these ways of visualizing interactions still that I think when you talk about discussion forums or things like that, or going forward, I think there will be other ways that we can visualize. Like if you look at, I think it was Ben Schmidt did some really interesting work on Rate My Professor and how genders were mapped against positive or negative language, or those kinds of things, you know what I mean? So there are layers of rhetoric that can play into this as well. And I think as we kind of go forward, like if you look back even 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, it wasn't possible or easy for anyone to visualize something. Whereas now it's actually quite easy to find a tool to do that. So I'm wondering too if you think that there is a way that with the advancement of those things, if those things can become more ways of measuring humanness in a course.
I think, look, two things. First, from the Rate My Professor study, I think one of the things that we learn there is that there are so many social and cultural variables at play in any setting that is complex in human terms that we need to be very aware of. So I'm thinking that one person's silence in a culturally diverse classroom, for example, one person's silence is very different from another person's silence. Yeah. Yesterday I met with some professional researchers in a healthcare setting, and we were talking about how to understand that some people are more prone to telling stories about themselves in their everyday workplace settings than others. And we looked at all of the complexity that might lie behind that in terms of family culture. If you are raised to be disclosing, or if you are raised to think of personal information as private, you will produce different kinds of presence in the world. And so what that made me think of as an educator is that I can concretely measure what appear to be similar behaviours, for example, silence. But I can't from that reliably interpret the significance of that silence to the silent person. And I realized this in an educational sense that I think transfers online, so I think it's useful for the people who are in Human MOOC. When I first started to use feedback mechanisms in class that asked students to tell me who was relevant to them in the class, whose contribution had helped them think. And it was not the same people I would have picked. So in other words, somebody who said one thing in 5 weeks, said such a devastating thing, such a thoughtful thing, such a trajectory-changing thing that people were still talking about it 5 weeks later. There were other people who spoke consistently every week, but people couldn't quite remember particularly anything they'd had to say. So I learnt that measuring speech acts, for example, would be an enormously unreliable way of understanding what's happening in a group of humans. Once we put it online, we start measuring speech acts. We start measuring, numbers of times somebody has done something. We start counting those things. We start counting the tweets. And I think, well, actually, we don't really do that in the far more complex intercultural settings in which we teach face-to-face. We don't count the numbers of times people speak. But when we're online, we feel that that is evidence of something really profound. And I think it might be evidence of our own sort of confusion at this point about what counts. What counts is what we can count.
That's such a good point. Can you imagine if we tried to count when we were like, okay, well, you counted, you spoke 5 times, you spoke 6 times, that would be hilarious. I think, Kate, you're getting on another point that I think is really interesting, is that there might be different types of silence, different types of introvert, right? And so, even jumping into this hangout with you guys is a little bit nervous for me, because I really do like to kind of work asynchronously. I do a lot of synchronous work too, and I've learned to have a real love for that kind of communication, but I think I really prefer to be able to kind of reflect first and then talk a little bit later. And so Helen actually Helen DeWard put a question into the question thing before we started, and I wanted to bring that up. This is, how do you mindfully connect with unconnected students and reach them when they are unreachable?
Well, that's a really interesting question. How do we do it in any setting, including online? I think the first step probably is to connect with curiosity, not to assume anything about their unconnectedness. The great example for me about this, I don't know if you've seen it, is Mike Wesch's video, The Sleeper. Mike Wesch, very familiar to all of us. Isn't it? If you haven't seen this, just hop onto YouTube and look for The Sleeper by educator Mike Wesch. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. And a student goes to sleep in his lecture at week in, week out, and he becomes progressively more challenged as an educator. He starts to put on more and more of a performance, brings more and more liveliness to his teaching. It becomes actually quite so frustrated, becomes quite irate with this student who is continually sleeping through his class, and eventually charges up to him and says, "Would you like to go to lunch?" And it's a terrific video. The outcome is fantastic. You can follow both of them on Twitter. I was delighted to find Daniel Deschant on Twitter too. It was a turning point for both of them. I think reconnecting with students who are having difficulty in their education, you need to just go with a totally open mind about what may be the cause. It may be well outside your purview. As it did in that case, it may surprise you what they are connecting with. The reason will not be what you think. And I think part of the problem here is that our institutions encourage us to take responsibility for every outcome in a student's lives. Whatever it is, it must be about us. This is extraordinary vanity. We are, in many cases, particularly disengaged students, quite marginal to the problems that are really preoccupying them. Many of our most disengaged students have severe financial trouble. They have mental health conditions that they don't dare disclose. They have ordinary life going on in a way that sometimes, also does happen. They have taken on too much of something else. Sometimes they're just doing something else in their learning, and we have been deprioritized. The best way to approach this, I hope this answers Helen's question, the best way to approach this is open-mindedly and with curiosity and a way of saying, you know the beautiful Lucinda Williams song, Are You All Right? I think we need to go in with Lucinda Williams' beautiful song, Are You All Right? That's all we can ask. And sometimes the answer will be yes, just your course is not the center of my life at this point. When I've asked students that question online and off, are you all right? I've always been startled by the answer. Something has come up that I had no idea was relevant to what appeared to me to be disengagement. So that's how I'd approach it. And Daniel, I think this is one of the perhaps while you, I don't know, before or after you joined us, I do think we can do some low-level "Are you all right?" checking using tools inside our platforms. We can't ask people to tell us what's all right or not in that environment, but we can simply ask them to say, I'm here. I'm all right, I'm fine, I'm just listening. Or, I'm not all right, how can I contact you? But Lucinda Williams, Are You All Right? It's the best song for this situation. Sometimes I just need a little clue, she says.
I love it. That's really great.
That's good. No, I think we've gone over the 30-minute mark. That's fine. We've had some great conversations, some great stuff come out. With the way of being human, you don't always have to keep, strict time. And we started, late anyway. So some technical difficulties, some time zone difficulties. So I just want to say thank you, Kate. You've given us a lot to think about. Thank you, Autumn Richard, joining us, also giving us stuff to think about, asking some good questions. We can continue the conversations on Twitter or in forums or on our blogs or in any other spaces that we've created in the garden or the stream for you to join in. We enjoy all of them. And I guess unless there's any final words from anyone, we can just go ahead and say everyone's good. All right. So thank you to everyone for joining us. And we will see you at the next Hangout, which I believe is scheduled for December 17th.
Thank you.
And I think that time zone is correct. So hopefully we'll see the right time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks so much for the conversation. Bye.
Thanks for letting me jump in.
Yeah.
Sure.